There is a person sitting in a cubicle somewhere on a Tuesday doing something with spreadsheets that they would struggle to explain to their great-grandmother in terms she could connect to anything recognizable as human activity. The fluorescent lighting is doing what fluorescent lighting does. The coffee is mediocre. The meeting that was scheduled for this afternoon could have been an email, and the email that arrived this morning could have been nothing at all. At some point around 2 p.m., with the particular existential clarity that Tuesday afternoons seem designed to produce, this person stares at their screen and wonders, not for the first time, but with unusual intensity today, how any of this happened, how the human species, which spent the overwhelming majority of its existence hunting animals and gathering plants in small social groups with no concept of quarterly performance reviews, ended up here. The answer is one of the most fascinating stories in human history, and it did not happen the way most people assume, not as a single invention, not as a sudden decision by some ancient entrepreneur who looked around and thought, you know what this situation needs? It needs roles. It happened gradually, messily, and through a series of transitions, each of which seemed reasonable at the time, and whose cumulative consequence nobody could have anticipated. The complete reorganization of human existence around structured work, occupational identity, and the exchange of labor for resources, a system so thoroughly embedded in modern life that most people cannot imagine existing outside it. The story of how humans invented jobs is really the story of how humans invented civilization. The two are inseparable, and it begins considerably earlier than most people think. The framing requires immediate complication because in one sense, humans never invented jobs. Work is as old as life itself, and the activities required to sustain human existence have been performed since the first anatomically modern humans existed. The question is not when humans started doing work. The question is when work became organized into roles, specialized, exchanged, compensated, and eventually formalized into the structured occupational categories we would recognize as jobs. And that transition from everyone doing roughly the same things for survival to people having differentiated, specialized roles within larger social systems is the transformation worth understanding. In the earliest human societies we can reconstruct from archaeological and ethnographic evidence, the division of labor was minimal and largely biological. The primary divisions, by sex and by age, were not occupational specializations in the modern sense, but rather practical allocations of tasks based on physical capability and social convention. Adult men in many hunter-gatherer societies focused more on large game hunting. Adult women more on plant food gathering, small game, and childcare. Elders provided knowledge, guidance, and certain crafts. Children contributed to what they could. These patterns varied across cultures and environments and were never absolute, but they represent the baseline division of labor that characterized most of human existence. Within this minimal division of labor, there were already specialists of a kind, individuals recognized within their groups as having exceptional skill in particular domains. The best tracker, the most effective healer, the most skilled knapper of stone tools, the person whose knowledge of edible plants was most extensive. These individuals were valued for their capabilities and likely contributed more in their areas of excellence while relying more on group resources in other areas. This informal specialization, task allocation based on demonstrated skill, is the embryonic form of the occupational differentiation that would eventually produce every job category that has ever existed. But informal specialization in a small mobile group is not the same as a job. A job requires something more. A stable social context in which specialization persists over time, in which individuals are identifiable as providers of a particular service or product, and in which some system of compensation, however informal, allows specialists to exchange their particular outputs for the resources they need from others. That requires a social structure large enough to sustain exchange, stable enough to make specialization worthwhile, and economically productive enough to generate surplus beyond immediate survival needs. That social structure required agriculture, and agriculture required staying in one place long enough to plant, tend, and harvest, which changed everything. The agricultural transition beginning approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent and independently in various other regions across subsequent millennia is the foundational event in the history of jobs. Not because agriculture itself created jobs, but because agriculture created the conditions under which occupational specialization became both possible and necessary. Settled agricultural communities produced surplus food. This was new. Hunter-gatherer groups groups generally consumed what they obtained without significant long-term storage capacity, because the mobile lifestyle that characterized their existence made accumulating large quantities of material goods impractical. A farming community that grew more food than it immediately needed could store that surplus in pits, in ceramic vessels, in granaries, and the existence of stored surplus created the economic foundation for supporting individuals who weren't growing food themselves. If a community produces more food than it needs, it can feed a potter who makes the vessels to store that food. It can feed a carpenter who builds the granary. It can feed a leader who organizes the community's defense and resource allocation. It can feed a specialist in whatever the community needs that agriculture alone doesn't provide. The surplus agricultural production of early farming communities was the economic engine that made occupational specialization viable for the first time in human history at scale. The earliest recognizable job specializations in the archaeological record appear in this context. Tool specialists, individuals who produced stone tools or later metal implements for others rather than each person making their own, are among the earliest documented specialists, identifiable through production site archaeology showing concentrations of manufacturing debris that indicate dedicated production rather than individual household toolmaking. Ceramic production, initially a household activity, gradually concentrated in the hands of specialists in some communities. The early evidence of these specializations appears in the Neolithic period across multiple regions roughly contemporaneously with the spread of settled agriculture. The ancient Mesopotamian city of Uruk, which emerged as one of the world's first true urban centers around 4000 BCE, provides the earliest unambiguous documentary evidence of formal job categories, and where the documentation comes from is itself revealing. The earliest writing in human history was not poetry, not history, not philosophy. It was accounting. The clay tablets of ancient Sumer record quantities of grain, numbers of animals, allocations of rations, and, critically, lists of workers and their occupational categories. These administrative records, generated by the temple bureaucracies that managed large-scale economic activity in early Mesopotamian cities, document an occupational structure of extraordinary complexity for its era. Brewers, bakers, smiths, potters, weavers, fishermen, gardeners, and dozens of other roles, each receiving standardized ration allocations in exchange for their labor. The ration lists of ancient Sumer represent the earliest known payroll records. Workers received allocations of barley, the primary currency of Mesopotamian labor exchange, calibrated to their role, skill level, and household composition. The system was not cash wages in the modern sense, but it was compensation. Structured exchange of labor for resources, administered through a bureaucratic system, documented in writing, and organized around occupational categories that defined what a person did and what they received for doing it. The word for the Sumerian ration is shi, barley, and its distribution was meticulous and documented. A master craftsperson received more than an apprentice. A skilled weaver received more than an unskilled laborer. The differentiation of compensation by skill and role is already present in the earliest employment records we have, which suggests that this differentiation emerged early in the formalization of work because it reflected genuine differences in the value. Different workers contributed to the economic system. The range of occupational categories documented in Mesopotamian records from the 3rd millennium BCE is remarkable. Beyond the agricultural and craft workers, there were scribes, the literacy specialists who made the record-keeping system itself possible. There were physicians whose treatments are documented in medical texts. There were priests and temple administrators who managed religious and economic functions that were deeply intertwined in Mesopotamian institutional life. There were soldiers whose compensation in land grants and rations is documented in military records. There were merchants whose commercial activities are documented in trade records that span considerable geographic distances. Ancient Egypt provides another extraordinarily well-documented case study in early job formalization, partly because the monumental construction projects of the Old and Middle Kingdoms required labor organization at a scale that generated detailed administrative records and archaeological evidence of worker communities. The builders of the pyramids were not slaves in the popular imagination sense. This historical misconception has been substantially revised by archaeological evidence from worker villages at Giza. Excavated worker settlements show evidence of organized communities with differentiated housing based on status and skill level, food preparation at a scale consistent with organized feeding of large workforces, and evidence of medical care including healed fractures and surgical interventions. Graffiti in quarries and construction sites refers to work gangs with names: Friends of Khufu, Drunkards of Menkaure, suggesting organized group identity and possibly competitive pride in workmanship. The workers were compensated in grain, bread, beer, fish, and clothing at rates that varied by skill level and role. Skilled artisans received more than general laborers. Supervisors received more than those they supervised. The organizational structure of a major construction project in ancient Egypt was hierarchical, role differentiated, and compensated through a sophisticated ration system that anticipated many features of modern employment relationships. Egyptian administrative texts document occupational categories with considerable detail. There were job titles for various grades of craftsmen, for administrative roles at different levels of the bureaucratic hierarchy, for agricultural workers at different stages of the agricultural cycle, and for the religious specialists who performed the extensive temple rituals that Egyptian society required. Career progression within occupational categories is documented. Apprentices becoming journeymen, journeymen becoming masters, masters achieving recognition as the best practitioners of their craft in their community or across a region. The social significance of occupational identity in ancient Egypt is visible in tomb inscriptions, which typically include the deceased's titles and roles prominently. A person was not merely identified by their family name, but by what they did, by their occupational position in the social hierarchy that organized Egyptian society. Job identity was personal identity in a way that reflects the depth of occupational structures' integration into ancient Egyptian social life. The development of currency, formalized media of exchange that could be stored, divided, and transferred between parties, accelerated the formalization of work relationships in ways that the ration-based systems of early Mesopotamia and Egypt could not fully achieve. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Commodity money, standardized quantities of valuable materials used as exchange media, appears in various forms across early civilizations. Cowrie shells, grain measures, copper ingots, and eventually silver by weight served as exchange media in different contexts. The Lydian invention of coined money in the 7th century BCE, standardized metal tokens with guaranteed weight and purity certified by state authority, represented a significant formalization that simplified exchange and enabled more complex economic relationships. With reliable currency, the exchange relationship between worker and employer could be expressed in abstract terms that transcended the commodities of ration systems. A worker could receive payment in a form that they could then exchange for whatever combination of goods and services they needed rather than receiving a predetermined bundle of rations. This flexibility accelerated occupational specialization by making it easier for workers to focus entirely on their area of specialization, knowing that their income could be exchanged for whatever their household required, rather than maintaining some subsistence production alongside their specialization. The Greek world of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE provides a well-documented example of a monetized economy with extensive occupational specialization. Athenian commercial records, legal texts, and philosophical writings document an economy with sophisticated division of labor across manufacturing, trade, services, and intellectual production. Craftsmen organized into workshops producing specialized goods for both local and export markets. Merchants specializing in trade across the Mediterranean with detailed knowledge of market conditions in different ports. Physicians with formalized training traditions and recognized expertise distinctions. Teachers charging fees for instruction in rhetoric, philosophy, and other disciplines. The Athenian agora, the central marketplace, concentrated commercial activity and created a physical geography of specialization, with specific areas associated with specific trades. The fish sellers, the grain merchants, the potters, the metal workers, occupational clustering in commercial spaces reflects the development of trade identities and the social organization of work around occupational communities that transcends individual workshops. The Roman Empire extended the formalization of work to an extraordinary degree of organizational complexity, including the development development of institutions, trade guilds, legal frameworks for commercial relationships, state employment systems that anticipated features of modern labor organization in ways that are sometimes surprising to discover. Roman collegia, occupational associations that combined economic, social, religious, and mutual aid functions, organized workers across an enormous range of trades and professions. There were collegia for bakers, for smiths, for merchants of various goods, for transport workers, for builders, for physicians, and for numerous other occupational categories. Membership conferred social identity, access to collective resources, including burial funds and mutual aid, and participation in shared religious observance centered on the patron deity of the trade. The functions of Roman collegia anticipate those of medieval guilds and, more distantly, of modern professional associations and labor unions. They regulated entry into trades through apprenticeship requirements. They maintained standards of practice. They negotiated collectively with municipal authorities. They provided social insurance functions including illness support and burial costs for members. The organizational sophistication of these institutions reflects the depth of occupational identity's integration into Roman social life and the degree to which work relationships had become formalized enough to require institutional management. Roman state employment systems provide another dimension of early job formalization. The Roman military was the world's first true professional army. Soldiers who served for fixed terms, received regular pay and currency, had defined career advancement pathways, received pension benefits in the form of land grants upon discharge, and were subject to detailed administrative records tracking their service. The parallel to modern employment relationships is striking enough that military employment historians sometimes describe the Roman legions as among the first recognizable professional workplaces in the modern sense. The Roman civil administration developed extensive bureaucratic employment with defined roles, career pathways, compensation structures, and eventually retirement provisions for imperial civil servants. The complexity of managing an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia required a professional administrative class with specialized competencies in law, finance, provincial administration, and military logistics, a class that was identifiably employed by the state in ways that distinguishable from both aristocratic service and slave labor. The medieval period in Europe saw the guild system develop into one of the most elaborate, formal occupational organization structures in pre-modern history, a system that regulated entry into trades, controlled quality standards, managed training and certification, and structured the social identity of urban workers in ways that would remain recognizable until the Industrial Revolution dismantled it. Medieval guilds were simultaneously economic organizations, social communities, and regulatory bodies. The craft guild controlled who could practice a trade within a given city through the master-journeyman-apprentice hierarchy that structured career progression. An apprentice entered formal training under a master craftsperson, typically through a multi-year indenture that exchanged labor and learning. Completing apprenticeship and demonstrating sufficient competence, sometimes through a masterpiece, a work demonstrating technical achievement, allowed advancement to journeyman status, with the right to work for wages in the trade. Accumulating capital and demonstrating master-level competence allowed eventual establishment of an independent workshop and guild membership. This system was often restrictive and frequently corrupt. Guild masters used their regulatory power to limit competition, maintain monopoly pricing, and exclude capable workers from advancement for reasons beyond competence. The masterpiece requirement could be used as a gatekeeping mechanism as much as a quality standard. Women were systematically excluded from most guild membership, limiting their participation in the skilled trades that guild organization covered. But the guild system also created real job security and quality standards within its limitations. Guild members had recognized occupational identity with social status attached. They had collective institutions managing their professional lives. They had training systems that transmitted skilled knowledge across generations. They had mutual aid arrangements providing some protection against the economic consequences of illness or injury. The guild system, whatever its limitations, represented a mature formalization of the idea that occupational identity deserves institutional recognition, collective organization, and regulated standards. The Industrial Revolution represents the most dramatic reorganization of work in human history since the agricultural transition, and its consequences for the nature of jobs are so fundamental that the modern concept of employment, as most people in industrialized countries understand it, is essentially a product of the industrial era. Pre-industrial work, even in its most formalized guild-organized forms, was largely artisanal. Individuals or small workshops producing complete goods through skilled processes that integrated integrated planning, execution, and quality assessment in the hands of the same worker. The industrial factory reorganized this into something categorically different. Large numbers of workers performing narrow, repetitive, standardized tasks as components of a production system whose overall output vastly exceeded what any individual or small workshop could produce, but whose individual tasks required less comprehensive skill than artisanal production. The factory imposed temporal discipline that artisanal and agricultural work did not require in the same form. Agricultural work rhythms followed seasonal and daily natural patterns with considerable flexibility in daily scheduling. Artisanal workers, especially self-employed masters, set their own working hours within the broad constraint of customer demand. The factory clock and its mechanical discipline, fixed start times, fixed end times, scheduled breaks, time-based wage payment imposed a temporal structure on work that remains the dominant framework of modern employment, and that workers in the early industrial period experienced as a profound imposition on their autonomy. The standardization of working hours, the formalization of employer-employee relationships in written contracts and eventually in labor law, the development of trade unions as the collective bargaining institutions of industrial workers, the creation of the modern concept of the weekend as a formalized boundary between work time and non-work time. All of these features of modern employment emerged from the industrial reorganization of work and the social conflicts it generated between workers and employers over the terms and conditions of the new relationship. The 20th century added layers of formalization to employment that would have been recognizable as sophisticated even by ancient Mesopotamian administrative standards. Employment contracts specifying terms and conditions, labor law establishing minimum wages, maximum hours, safety standards, and anti-discrimination protections, social insurance systems, unemployment insurance, retirement pensions, workers' compensation that extended the mutual aid functions of ancient guilds to national scale, professional certification and licensing systems that echoed guild requirements in formalized, state-recognized form, human resources departments dedicated to managing the administrative complexity of employment relationships. The concept of the job description, a formalized written specification of what a particular role involves, what qualifications it requires, and what it will pay, represents perhaps the endpoint of the formalization process that began with Sumerian ration lists. The idea that a role should be defined and documented before the person filling it is selected would have been recognizable in principle to a Mesopotamian temple administrator. The complexity and standardization of modern job documentation would have astonished them. The person in the cubicle on Tuesday afternoon, staring at their spreadsheet, is the current endpoint of a process that began approximately 10,000 years ago when the first farming communities started supporting individuals who were not farmers. Every administrative innovation, every occupational institution, every formalization of the relationship between work and compensation that accumulated across that entire period has contributed to the specific cubicle, the specific spreadsheet, and the specific mediocre coffee that characterized this particular Tuesday. The meeting that could have been an email is the direct descendant of administrative inefficiency that has characterized organized human activity since the first Mesopotamian temple scribe called an unnecessary meeting about grain allocation. The performance review that arrives in November has ancestors in the Egyptian supervisor who assessed which workers deserved higher rations. The professional certification that qualified someone for the job they are not enjoying has medieval guild masters somewhere in its institutional lineage. Jobs were not invented. They accumulated through the agricultural surplus that made specialization possible, through the urban complexity that made specialization necessary, through the administrative systems that documented and formalized what specialization had produced, through the legal and institutional frameworks that regulated and protected the resulting relationships, and through the industrial transformation that reorganized all of it into the time-disciplined, clock-governed, contractually specified employment relationships that most of the modern world now inhabits. The Sumerian barley ration, the Egyptian workers' bread allocation, the Roman legionaries' denarius, the medieval guildmaster's workshop, the Victorian factory workers' time card, they are all versions of the same fundamental human arrangement. You do this thing that the group needs done, and the group gives you what you need to live. The cubicle is newer than it looks. The arrangement it houses is ancient beyond reckoning, and the Tuesday afternoon existential questioning of how any of this came to be is probably the most human response to the situation available, because humans have been wondering about the meaning of work for approximately as long as work has existed in the form of a job, which, as it turns out, is quite a long time.